Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hey, it's Jessa. Welcome back to another episode of the Better Sex Podcast. Thank you for hanging out with me. I appreciate it. I'm going to revisit a topic, it relates to things I think we've talked a lot about on the podcast. I'm interviewing today Katherine Rowland, who wrote a book called The Pleasure Gap. And she's a journalist and had interviewed a lot of women and done all this research around this gap. Actually, it turns out to be three different gaps. The gap in reported pleasure between men and women in general in their sex life and in individual encounters. The gap between the sex we want and the sex that's portrayed all around us. What we're sold to, want, convinced we want versus what we actually find meaningful. And then the gap between the experience of being physiologically aroused, but not mentally aroused, not engaged, feeling numb, cut off from our experiences. There's sort of these three arenas that have come to be encapsulated in the pleasure gap. But anyway, she's largely talking about what is the experience of women around sexual pleasure, around permission and access to their own desires, to what's meaningful for them in sex, what cuts them off from that, potentially what opens the door to that. Anyway, it's a fascinating conversation, and my hope is that you're going to get a lot out of it. I hope you enjoy. And before we start the show today, it is sponsored by Intimacy with Ease. It's a method to help otherwise happy couples achieve a sex life that is easy and fun for both of them, so that you can actually just enjoy your sex life with zero stress. For more information, if you want to watch a brief little training video that's available, all of that, go to intimacywithease.com. So, Katherine, thanks so much for being with me today.
Thanks for having me with you.
Yeah. Would you start by just sort of talking about the pleasure gap, the concept of this, and then how you came to write the book? I don't know which came first, if you discovered this concept through writing a book or whether it was the opposite.
Yes, well, I came to both the concept and the book through my sort of long-standing interest in efforts to bring a female Viagra to market. And I will step back by saying that female Viagra is a major misnomer. All the drugs on the market currently, and there are two, are not Viagra-like in that they don't work to expand women's sexual ability, but rather sort of help to make women more sexually available. But I had been monitoring these activities for a long time as a journalist and as a public health researcher, and they were fascinating to me because they were essentially positing this idea that there was something amiss with women's desire fundamentally.
Right.
I was curious to understand, well, what is that? How do we understand desire that's too high or too low, normal or abnormal? Because this is this incredibly subjective, ephemeral realm.
And systemic, right? It's not a thing. It's connected to all kinds of things. So
right, it's connected to all things. So how do you sort of condense it or try to approach it as a trait as opposed to a state that is entirely contingent on our experiences, our circumstances, our passing moods, our different ways of being in the world? So I was sort of troubled by what I saw taking place in the medical arena and set out to talk to women about their own experiences of desire and pleasure. And that led me eventually to write this book. And the pleasure gap as a concept, I think of in broad strokes as a description of social inequality, as a measure of social inequality. But in more concrete terms, I think about it as three intersecting ideas. And one is the differences that we see showing up between male and female accounts of sexual experiences, that men, both anecdotally and in the research, repeatedly report being more satisfied with sexuality over the long term and in discrete encounters, that they achieve orgasm more readily, that they're happier with their sex lives overall, that they feel less distress, less pain, less anxiety, less suffering in general, whereas women report very commonly to experience low desire, absent pleasure, muted or sort of meh orgasms, sexual aversion, general disinterest, and to moreover to really beat themselves up for feeling that way.
Right,
that
right.
somehow, even though this is a universal, not universal, but it is an endemic problem, they turn to themselves as the locus of the issue.
Yeah, yeah.
So I was interested in peering into those reported differences between male and female experience and understanding why that pleasure gap exists. And I was interested too in looking at the pleasure gap as it exists in terms of the different states that we experience within our own bodies, and more specifically how our minds react to sexual stimuli versus how our genitals or physiology responds. And what you see showing up a lot of times is that women will offer accounts of feeling sexually numb or disinterested or totally disengaged. They'll report expressions like, my genitals feel dead, or I feel completely cut off and disassociated. And yet, when you go into the lab and sort of take a look at what's going on, there's absolutely no physiological problem.
So physiologically they're responding, but it's not hitting their brain, basically, right?
Like it's not hitting their brain. Exactly. Yeah. So what is interfering into that relationship? That was another aspect of the pleasure gap that was really fascinating to me. And then finally, and this goes back to what I mentioned about women sort of beating themselves up for a perceived problem, I was interested in the really huge rift, I think, between the sex that we're sold on as that we should be having and what we actually crave and delight in and really want, and why that distance feels to be so great and maybe even greater as we're living in a culture that is incredibly libidinous and broadcasts sex to an unprecedented degree, and yet we're not enjoying all this sex that we're having.
Yeah. Let's start with that one. How do you make sense of that? The fact that sex is everywhere, right? Omnipresent, and yet somehow there's this gap in what people are actually enjoying or their level of engagement with it.
I think that's a huge question. Part of it, I think, is attributable to our new understanding of what kind of a liberated identity is. We are sort of taught to believe that we should want sex, that we should have this hip swaggering approach as we're strutting down the street, and to really crave intimacy and to delight in it. And yet when it comes to actual interactions, we're not. And so why is that? I think a huge part of that is that women are still not taught anything about pleasure or desire. And I've been thinking about this a lot, specifically with regard to the conversations around consent that we're currently having, and how it's really wonderful and it's overdue and it's absolutely necessary that we're finally talking about consent and consent education. But that conversation, by and large, continues to exclude women's desire. Sex is still framed as something that men or those with more social power want and that they try to obtain more of, whereas women or those with lesser social power are trying to limit that access. And
so it's almost like the men want it and the women consent to it.
Right.
Right? Like that's become the conversation. So at least we're getting consent, maybe, but that's not really like embracing or,
It's still a passive state. It's
Yeah.
sent to something else, and it's not leading with women's desire. And when you actually ask women, well, what do you want? So many come away with saying, like, I don't frankly know.
Yeah.
And I think we need to intervene on a very 101 level into teaching women that pleasure is part of healthy sexuality and indeed public health more generally, into really embracing what it is they want and feeling comfortable in exploring what those terms might be. Because even though sex is more loudly broadcast than ever before, the kind of sex that's on offer is still sort of mythic in its dimensions. It's like man pins woman against a door frame and thrusts a few times and she's moaning to the moon, and it simply doesn't work that way.
Right. Yeah, that is what's portrayed. So what did you learn about these three different gaps, I guess, right? These three different aspects to the pleasure gap. Like I'm curious sort of what you went in knowing or thinking, and then what came of the research.
I think all research is a fundamentally humbling activity. So, you go in.
You think you know what you're going to find, right? And then
you suddenly are actually confronted with this wealth of material that really puts you in your place. But
yeah.
I think, on the first level, what I most strongly came away with was the sense that we really do a disservice to both male and a female sexuality. I think just as we tend to overly complicate women's sexuality and describe it in terms of mysterious and elusive and strange, by token, we overly simplify male sexuality in thinking that men just blindly pursue arousal and release. And while we attribute to women kind of an unwavering pursuit of emotional closeness and bonding and an underlying instinct to nest and sort of deprive them of the just libidinous appetite that is often there for a lot of women, but tempered by social constraints, we rarely allow men to pursue and to nurture the kind of emotional connection that actually makes for satisfying relationships. And so I think that our conversations tend to get derailed into obsessions with chronicling gender difference, and that isn't all that insightful.
It's almost like we've created that gender difference, right? It's been culturally reinforced or something, as opposed to, right? Is it a reaction, or is it the root?
It's like a project we're deeply committed to. And I think we're beginning to see the dismantling of that in the midst of all these really necessary conversations that are taking place. But I found that maybe pursuing these terms of difference wasn't the most productive, because what actually makes for satisfying sex has little to do with biological sexual difference or gender difference. It's really about intimacy and freedom of expression and creativity and safety and feeling fully, and it's about empowerment, feeling fully able to really explore what it is that actually turns you on and what it is you want.
Right. And so if women historically have reported less satisfaction, less access to exactly what you just described, it's like men haven't, if I'm hearing you right, they've described more satisfaction because they've been limited to how they think about it. It's about arousal and release. So yeah, sure, I'm satisfied. It's almost like they haven't gotten a big enough view, right? They haven't been allowed that, or it's not reinforced anyway, culturally.
Absolutely. I think they're following a pretty narrow tunnel of what sex can look like.
Yeah. I know in my practice, as a sex therapist, and I just see couples, it's frequently, first of all, it's not always the male, if it's a heterosexual couple, it's not always the guy who wants more sex, right? But it's almost like whoever's more interested in sex can be accused of just wanting to get off, just wanting sex, right? And so much of the time the person's like, no, I'm longing to connect with you. Sex is important and it's impactful, but it's because I want to share this experience with you. And somehow that conversation doesn't happen in our larger culture, it seems like.
Yes, I mean, I think against all of these sort of riveting discussions about the nature of sexuality, the US remains an incredibly sexually conservative culture where just to even express an interest in sex is immediately to express something that is taboo and shameful
Yeah.
and somehow wrong, as opposed to, no, this is another expression of myself. You don't denigrate my professional aspirations.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what did you learn about the gap between, okay, we've got a physiological sexual response, and then there's our brain registering, like, I'm totally not in this?
I came away with a couple of different conclusions on that front. And part of what I looked at is this body of research around what's called interoception. And interoception, as I'm sure you know, but as your listeners may not, is sort of your level of attunement to what's taking place within your body. It's, are you aware of elevated heart rate? Are you aware of blood pressure? How hungry are you? You know, are your limbs activated or intense, or are you feeling nice and relaxed? And what's so interesting there is that the research time and again suggests that men are more attuned to interoception than women are, that
Really?
their internal states more actively influence their emotional state. And that really flies in the face of what we think about when we think
Huh.
about men and women with their bodies, because we're so used to ascribing women's emotionality to their hormones and to thinking about women as fundamentally moody. And I offer in my book that as a child, I recall asking my father why there had never been a female president. And in all seriousness, my father, this man who had a doctorate and was deeply educated, says, well, you know, it's going to be that time of the month and women are going to press that big red button and the world's going to fly off the handle.
Oh,
And that might be sort of an extreme interpretation, but that's not all that far afield in terms of how we're used to thinking about men and women and their relationships between body and emotion. But what you see instead is that women, whether this is historically or if this is something, as I throw out there, that perhaps it is, it's been acquired more recently, is that women are more adept at silencing what's going on in their bodies and sort of shutting that off in order to be more externally attuned. And there's all kinds of theories as to why that might be the case, and none are really satisfactory. I think, you know,
yeah.
in so many of these areas of inquiry, there's efforts to parse apart biology and culture, and you simply cannot, because none
Yeah.
of it exists outside of culture, and neither does the science.
Right.
But what you do see show up in other arenas in women's lives is that women are oftentimes more susceptible to fatal heart attacks than men are, because they are silencing what's taking place in their bodies, and they are sort of working or oftentimes performing domestic chores through frontline indicators of heart disease,
Yeah.
and dropping dead in the kitchen or in the middle of doing chores, whereas men will say, oh no, there's something wrong. And women will say, no, I'm just fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think there's a real corollary there between women not listening to those cues and women not being able to drop into their own arousal during sexuality.
Right. Right.
And so I think that's a big piece of it. Another big piece, and I was really, I had a sense that I would encounter this when I waded into the research, but was unprepared for the extent to which it was true, but just the prevalence of sexual trauma and transgression and how that really hindered women's experiences of their own bodies, and whether that meant that they often felt numb and they had to drop out of their experience, or they felt kind of hyper activated, hyper vigilant, and were so stressed during sexual encounters that they weren't able to fully enjoy what was taking place. And
so you're talking about historical trauma for women. They've had some sort of abuse or trauma in their past, and that is still impeding their ability to relax, be present, be fully in their body and their experience.
Absolutely. That it's
Yeah.
still showing up in one way or another. And
Yeah.
what I was surprised to find was the number of times women would report having felt as though they worked through something only to have life circumstances change. And this incident or multiple incidents would bubble back up to the surface and they'd say, "What's wrong with me?" And, what's wrong is that your grandfather committed these horrible transgressions against your juvenile body. And
Right. Yeah, as if that should be a simple fix, or we should be able to put that behind us somehow, right? And
right.
Yeah.
And I think that inability to quote, put it behind you or to even work through it is compounded by so much of what's available on the popular solutions market, which says you should get over this, you should transcend, you should be self-empowered and just move on, as opposed to reckoning with the systemic circumstances that make these kinds of abuses as prevalent as they are. And so many of the fixes, I think, are ultimately disempowering to women because they promote this highly individualistic solutions model as opposed to a cultural shakeup, which is what's really needed.
Right. And and it strikes me too, we're talking not just about the traumas that are sort of identifiable, like those events or whatever, but there's so much low-level, subtle, low-T trauma, lowercase t, or just culturally, right? Women are oppressed.
Women
largely.
Are oppressed.
Yeah. And so that's trauma that we live with all the time too.
Right. And you're wading through this miasma of representation and circumstance. And, even if something really grave didn't happen to you, it sure enough happened to your sister, or your mother, or your friends, or your cousins. And you see it represented all the time in media.
Yeah.
It's certainly represented in pornography, and the women I talked to were acutely aware of that.
Yeah.
And the sense that their violent objectification was a form of erotic interest. And I think that often leads to forms of self-objectification and self-surveillance that intervene into women being able to experience the delight that their bodies are capable of experiencing.
Right. Okay, we're going to just take a short little break here, and I want to let you know about Intimacy with Ease, the method that helps otherwise happy couples create a sex life that is fun, easy, light for both people. So if you are an otherwise happy couple, if sex is the elephant in the room or sex is the little bit of the challenge for you guys, you may want to check this out. You can go to intimacywithease.com and you'll see information there. You'll see short videos. You'll have access to a full webinar about it. All kinds of information to let you know if this would be the right thing for you. Another thing strikes me, I don't know if this came up in your conversations, but that gap between, okay, my genitals are aroused, but my brain is not, also seems like it could be more like, well, sex isn't just because it's physically arousing doesn't mean it's engaging, right? Like, I don't know if it's always a disconnect as much as why are we judging everything about whether I'm lubricating, as opposed to there's more to sex than whether that feels good on my genitals or something, like that would be another reason for that gap, is for missing what's really important.
Right, that we're sort of obsessed with genital performance and genital reaction as opposed to understanding the larger universe of arousal and desire, which I think is why so many of the drugs that have tried to make their way into women's medicine cabinets tend to miss the mark, because they might improve lubrication or genital swelling, but women will say, well, this has absolutely no bearing on how I actually feel about sex.
Yeah. So what did the women that you talked to, how did people describe great sex? Was there consensus, but were there themes around the things that really are important that would increase women's pleasure and interest?
There were, and I would describe those as presence, as really being able to fully inhabit the moment. And for some women, that was achieved through more, let's say, clinical interventions like mindfulness practices.
Mm-hmm.
But for a lot of women, it was more a sense of being overwhelmed by experience. Like what they were participating in swelled to proportions that it was able to shut down the quotidian hum of their lives, and they weren't thinking about the dishes or the cracks in the ceiling or picking up their children from school. It was all encompassing. And I was pleased to find that because I'd read a lot about how what women really crave is dominance. And I was so tired of seeing that because it felt like a really tired expression of female longing. Like we're really going back to this, that women want to be dragged back to the cave and sort of pummeled into the submission. And, a lot of women did say that they wanted expressions of power and often politically incorrect power from their partners. But I don't think that had anything to do with dominance in the social sense. It was more they wanted that erotic encounter to be truly overwhelming.
Like it could overtake them, right? Which forces them out of regular life and their regular mindset or something like that.
Yeah, and it just sort of jolts them into sex as a very different state of being.
Yeah.
So that was one big part of it. Another was around feeling safe, like they could feel safety in the full erotic expression of their full self. And that's tethered to reasons that we just discussed.
Mm-hmm.
And then finally, I felt the overarching theme was liberating the imagination. It was closing in on that distance between fantasy and practice, and even liberating fantasy life. Was an issue that a lot of women express, sort of being able to reach further and further into the depths of their souls and often the darkness of their imagination to harvest these new ideas about what might feel good. And that was a real act of cracking open oftentimes what they thought they could and should be, because that sex that you really crave, and I'm sure you see this in your practice, but it frequently isn't having a sort of polite romp in the sheets with your spouse of 35 years.
Right.
And so when women spoke about really magnificent or transcendent sex, it was a crossing of that distance oftentimes. But I will underscore, and this isn't my unique insight by any means, I drew pretty heavily from the work of Peggy Kleinplatz, the Canadian sexologist and therapist. But she's conducted a lot of studies into what makes for good sex.
Yes.
And part of why that research is so interesting is that it highlights the fact that there is such a dearth of research on what makes for good sex, because we tend to focus on sexual pathology and sexual risk instead of what is magnificent experience.
Right.
And Peggy's work, and this shows up in my own research, is that good sex has absolutely nothing to do with physical mechanics and interlocking body parts. And it's such I think collective sadness that what shows up in the media is, here are 6 positions to try for a steamy weekend, and, try doing it on the coffee table and on the side of the couch. And that just absolutely means nothing, because it's about the quality of the encounter. And it's about how do you liberate the imagination and open up the bounds of the embrace of your relationships to make this kind of transcendence possible. And the last thing I'll say on this subject is that I sort of found myself walking a little uneasily around the question of spirituality, but a lot of women who talked about really moving, magnificent, and memorable sex, framed it in what I could only describe as spiritual terms, about sex as being a great cracking open or a portal into the human interior, or as a form of passage. One woman described great sex as homecoming, which I thought was just so gorgeous. But it was a sort of a restoration of the full potential of the self. And I think it's important that great sex, when women spoke about it, it was nothing that they had achieved and then that was their forever plateau.
Right.
They still understood that great sex was highly contextual, and that, like desire, it's a state that is reachable, but
but it's not like you arrive there and stay, right? Like it's a
right.
Yeah. Well, and I'm really struck by when you say presence and safety and imagination as elements or themes of great sex. None of that references genitals, right? Like you're saying,
Right.
It's not about what you do with your body parts, right? It's really much more about the quality of the experience on those levels.
Yes. But so much of our education and our exposure is just genitally fixed.
Right.
So we're excluding these other realms of possibility.
Right. Well, that's why, to my mind, that's part of why we say the brain is the biggest sex organ, right? It's not, it's just so crucial.
Exactly.
So is there anything, based on all the research and all this thinking, obviously this is, very interesting to you. Are there action steps or takeaways? Like, it sounds like the book was based on research and descriptive, kind of pursuits, but what maybe emerged as what should people do with this information?
I try to take pains in saying that this book is not prescriptive. And even though I highlight a lot of different courses of self-inquiry and a sort of erotic amplification that women explore, I'm not trying to recommend any.
Okay.
I wanted more to provide a narrative roadmap through what I saw as an exploding terrain. There's just so much information out there right now.
Yeah.
And that has become all the more prolific in our internet age. And I think all the more, I would go so far as to use the word dangerous in the era of the internet, because you'll find peer-reviewed studies appearing alongside weekend retreats devoted to, squirting intensives.
Right.
There's so many voices claiming to be expert out there right now. But if I were to offer,
if I really twist your arm, right?
Yeah, if you want my personal and policy recommendations, on a very personal level, I would advise that women try to shut off that external noise as much as possible and to gain as much intimate education about their own bodies and desires and proclivities as they can.
Yeah.
I know for a lot of women that really means starting from scratch. And a large number of women that I spoke to, less so the younger women, but more, I would say, women my age in their 40s, they had never looked at their genitals.
Mm-hmm.
And women often have a pretty comfortable relationship with their vibrator, which is great in that they know how to self-pleasure, but they don't have a relationship with their own hands. And so just learning self-intimacy and getting really comfortable with that feels absolutely crucial.
Right.
So just that very basic, not even sexual education, but erotic education on a personal level.
Yeah.
And I think with that in your pocket, you are often less susceptible to the wild claims and accusations that circulate in the media all around you. And you can sort of hush those unnecessary voices and feel those pressures less in your body. Because if you know what your orgasm looks and feels and sounds like, I think the pressure to have an orgasm that looks and sounds like that of a porn star certainly lessens.
Yeah.
I do want to highlight, sort of as an aside, one piece of research that came up that was so striking to me, but I visited the lab of Dr. Nicole Prouse. She's based out in Santa Monica, and she's done research looking at pleasure and orgasm, and has struggled to conduct a lot of that research because there's such scientific baggage surrounding that kind of inquiry. But in one study, she found she was asking participants to indicate when, after a period of stimulation, they had experienced orgasm. And she had a number of elements in place to determine if orgasm was taking place, sort of like looking at rhythmic contractions and blood flow and heart rate and all of that. And she found that fully 50% of the female participants in this study were stating that they had had an orgasm when an orgasm hadn't actually taken place.
Wow.
And this is a small study, so it's not generalizable to the entire population, but she checked and double checked her data and said, this is just absolutely impossible. How could this be? But then ultimately her conclusion was, this is evidence of not that women are lying or misreporting, but that they just lack this basic education into what an orgasm is, because there's no way, in the absence of real discussion, there's no way for women to learn this crucial information.
Right. I certainly have had numerous women in my practice when I ask if they've been, orgasmic, and it's like, I'm not sure. I don't know, and it's because I think they do have this idea of what it's supposed to look and sound like, first of all. So they may diminish or dismiss their own experience, right? Or then other people just haven't discovered it yet.
Yes.
But they don't know. Yeah.
Right. Or women also describe to me, and maybe you've encountered this too, but sort of approaching that mounting sensation and then backing off of it because it felt like too much.
Right. That happens too. So, yeah. And I think part of my takeaways in terms of, these are sort of always on my mind as action steps, but, letting go of this idea that we're broken, that something is wrong with us, that it should be working differently, and giving ourselves permission and freedom to explore what we actually enjoy, what we actually want, what actually matters to us, and then to advocate for that, right? To, take up some space. So,
right. To truly take up some space there. I think a number of women, there's some women that I kind of labeled in my mind as having traversed the pleasure gap. And for a lot of them, they describe themselves initially in really damning terms like frigid and just horrible and cold and broken and damaged. And it took really hard, often daring work to say, what is it that I need? And for some, it was really active dismantling of the terms of relationships that they had thought that they required, like looking into what should the structure of long-term partnership be. Maybe monogamy doesn't actually work for me. And I know that this particular point in my book has rubbed some readers the wrong way because the text as kind of a apology for non-monogamy. And I really don't intend it to be that. It's rather that a number of women that I spoke to chafed under long-term monogamy. And
again, it's about figuring out what actually works for you, for each person, right? There's not one thing that's best for everybody.
Yes. And this was their genuine response to that considered inquiry.
Yeah. Yeah. So would you just say a word about, the title of the book, where people can find it? Where could people find you? Just so they can reach out if they want to.
Absolutely. So the book is The Pleasure Gap, American Women and the Unfinished Sexual Revolution. It's available now through Barnes & Noble, Amazon, IndieBound, in real life, wherever books are sold. And I can be found, more information about me, my background, and how to contact me through my personal website at katherinerowland.com. And that's ROWLAND.
Great. I'll put those links in the show notes too, so people don't have to pull over and try to jot that down. So,
okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
And that's a wrap for today. I really hope you enjoyed the episode. If you are enjoying the podcast, if some of this material resonates with you and you would like to make a difference and make sure that this keeps coming out in the world once a week, ongoing, there are a couple things you could do to show your appreciation. The first would be to go to iTunes and rate and review the show. That really helps us be found by new listeners when you review the show on iTunes. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/iTunes. The other thing I want to invite you to consider is becoming a Patreon. For a small monthly pledge, you get some benefits. So for $2 a month, you get advance access to every single episode. For $5 a month, you get a chapter of my upcoming new book. And for $10 a month, I host quarterly get-to-know-you and question-and-answer chats over the web, and you get invited to that. I would love to have your membership in that, become part of the Better Sex family. You can find a link at bettersexpodcast.com/Patreon, which is Patreon. Again, thanks for listening. I'm glad you're here. Feel free to comment, ask questions, get in touch. I'd love to hear from listeners. Thanks.